let's talk temporal coupling. Temporal coupling. As I said before, if we're doing synchronous blocking request-response communication, that indicates a high degree of temporal coupling between things. All right? So A calling B, usually the canonical situation where there are these types of request-response models is queries. Whereas a part of processing some request, I need data from another quote-unquote service. And until I get that data back, I can't really do anything. So there's sort of a natural temporal coupling in place there. Now, be careful that when developers hear, oh, the problem is synchronous, let's just make it asynchronous and multi-threaded, and then they start writing all sorts of complex multi-threaded garbage. Multi-threaded is one of those things that you should almost always avoid. Martin Fowler has a saying. He says, there are maybe 5 people on planet Earth that can and should be writing multi-threaded code. I'm not one of them. And when Martin Fowler says that of himself, you can be pretty sure that most of us probably don't fit into the category of one of the 5 people that should be writing multi-threaded code. My concern with the .NET platform that's now kind of gradually been spreading out to other platforms via the async await keywords is that now more and more developers are sprinkling in asynchronicity into their code all over the place. And that can open up all sorts of nasty opportunities for deadlocks and live locks and data races and all of the bad things of multi-threading, just with the ability to do it with that many fewer lines of code. So I'm concerned. And still we went full async within Service Bus, yes. It was one of those things that, again, once Microsoft had made the framework itself async all the way through, that in essence they dragged all the other libraries and frameworks along with them. Because if we didn't, then developers would still be left trying to figure out, well, I'm talking to a database, ADO.NET async, and Service Bus is sync. How do I bridge those two worlds? So we've been spending a great deal of time trying to explain to people, oh, okay, this is how async is supposed to work, and doing webinars and writing blog posts to say, do this, don't do that. Oh, by the way, we've created a plugin for Visual Studio to give you all sorts of blue squigglies when you do the wrong thing, or to create these sort of cross-cutting injectors that will fill in the configure await false for you so that you don't have to remember to do that. It's awful, but you know, the cast has been die, the die has been cast. That's what happens when you do async await. Sometimes things get reversed. So you got that now, did you? So you know, we ended up having to do it and then went full async top to bottom. But in general, you see multi-threading code, run away. How do we solve this problem of doing queries, getting data in a non-temporally coupled way? So in essence, what we do is we invert the data flow. Still, A depends on B, but instead of request-responsing the data when we need it, we subscribe to changes to that data so that in essence, we're moving to a callback model. Rather than a call model, it's a callback model. So that the data is pushed to us in advance of us needing it, so that we have a copy of the data so that when we need to use it, we've already got it. We don't need to ask for any more of it. All right? Now, this is not 100% equivalent because in essence, in this model, we're using somewhat stale data. Right? We're using a previously cached copy of the data, whereas in the request response model, we're getting fresh data. Or so we might be led to believe. So tell me, does anybody here do caching in their systems? Caching, yes. Okay. Caching often happens behind a request response API, right? We don't always, when we get a request, go all the way to the database to go get the results. We'll go to some cache. So the issue here is not stale data versus fresh data. The question is, are we going to cache on this side or are we going to cache on that side? All right? It's not a question of if you're going to cache, it's a question of where. All right? And that's the important distinction. Data will be somewhat stale in a distributed system. The only way to avoid that is by opening up distributed transactions across everything and everything else. And we tried that once, and it didn't scale, and then we stopped doing that. So given that caching is a given, now the question is, on which side are we going to be putting it? I'd like to posit that that side is better. Why? Because it's more explicit. It makes it clearer to business stakeholders, I am using somewhat stale data as a part of this processing logic. And I think that's significant in the business giving me feedback as to how good my architecture is. But let me come back to that in just a second. So some other things about doing this sort of publish-subscribe temporal decoupling. First of all, a subscriber must be able to make decisions based on somewhat stale data. That is something we need to verify with business stakeholders. It's not just a given. In order for that to happen, there tends to be a strong division of responsibility between a publisher and subscriber, primarily because publishers are dealing with the correctness of the data in the moment, and subscribers are dealing with the, well, what am I going to do next? As sort of, now I have stale data, what do I do with it? This leads us to a conclusion that is fairly significant, that we should only allow for a given logical publisher, only one, for a given type of event. In other words, moving to PubSub still requires a single source of truth. Now I want to distinguish, we're talking about logical publisher, not necessarily physical. That could be scaled out over a number of machines, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in our PubSub messaging patterns. But let me describe what would happen if this rule was not applied. So let's say that there was more than one logical publisher for a given type of event. And let's treat what we have in this classroom as sort of a pseudo PubSub type of scenario. All of you, by walking in this door, in essence have subscribed to events that are being published by me. Now imagine there's one me at the front that's publishing an event saying, temporal coupling good. And then there's another me over here 2 seconds later that says, temporal coupling bad. Which value do you use?
Which one comes first?
Which one comes first? Well, that's a good question, because is it which one was published first or which one did you receive first? Because they might not arrive in the same order as they were published, right? And there's no guarantee. By saying that they're logically independent publishers, each of them has their own data model behind them. So in essence, we're saying you as a subscriber have to figure out what is not the source of truth, but what is the truth, given that you have more than one source of potential truths. And it's kind of hard for you to do that based on stale data, right? That's the challenge. That when building a distributed system, we still need to have a source of truth. Subscribers can never be that source of truth. So we can say, oh, it should be first one wins, or it should be last one wins. Oh, I don't know, let's take the average of both results. Once we start doing that, we start taking responsibility away that should have been on the publisher side. All right? So the only way that PubSub works is if there still is a single source of truth. All right, and I wanted to reinforce that. Logical publisher, not physical, right? We can scale out a given physical publisher, but ultimately for a given piece of data, we still need a single source of truth. Now, some other quick things about how to design events, just so that we get this out of the way really quickly. You want to avoid things that are fundamentally requests or commands. So don't be publishing an event like save customer requested. If it's a command, save customer, then that's what it is. It's not an event. All right? Other things that are good attributes of events, of things that are being published, state something that has already happened. So it should be framed in the past tense. So save customer requested is kind of past tense-ish. But until the customer has actually been saved, we can't really say that there's something meaningful at the business level that's happened. So let me drive this point home even further. The subscriber shouldn't be able to invalidate it, all right? The event should state, this has already happened. The customer has been saved. The order has been accepted. The product has been discontinued. Something that is a fact in the business domain. And that the subscriber's question is, given that that's true, what else should I do? All right? So not invalidating it. Now, if you're including raw business data in there, so let's say the value of a given product is $2 or 15 pounds or whatever that is. If you have to talk about data, try to think about the validity period of that data. All right? So meaning if you're publishing, say, a product price updated event that includes the price, consider including a valid from or a valid to attribute on that. Why is that important? It's helpful in dealing with those elements of, well, maybe the events arrive out of order. Or maybe I don't receive an event for a long period of time, and I want to know, can I still sell a product for that price? So anytime you're sharing raw business data across a publish-subscribe boundary, have a conversation with your business stakeholders. Say, well, what should its validity period be? What happens if we don't publish another event for a certain period of time? That will go back to reinforce the strong division of responsibility between publishers and subscribers. Okay? So, some final things about when to do pub/sub and when not to do pub/sub. Could be that when you design your services, you come up and say, all right, I'm going to put A over here and B over there and C over here and D over there. This is how I'm going to divide up the responsibility, and I'm going to do some pub/sub between them. Important to make this clear to the business stakeholder what use case is going to be using potentially stale data. There might be cases where the business, after you explain the division of boundaries, they'll say, wait a minute, you're saying that I'm going to have a given piece of functionality that is going to operate on A and a stale copy of B. I'm sorry, that's not going to work for me. A and B always have to be 100% in sync for our business to work, which is a fancy way of the business telling you your architecture is wrong. Saying you put A and B in different services, they can't be, they have to be in the same service. And they might tell you the same thing, you know, C, D, and E all need to be in sync with each other all the time. Don't just take that at face value. That's a part of the business analysis architecture responsibility, is to evaluate, is that really true? Is that a workaround? What is this trying to achieve? We'll get into more detailed examples as we go along in this course to be able to figure out, is that true? Do I need to change my architecture? But the thing that I like most about publish-subscribe is not that it's solving the temporal decoupling issues, but rather that it provides a mechanism where business stakeholders can say, your architecture is wrong, your service boundaries are wrong. And I don't have to wait until I've written tons and tons of code and gone into production for that kind of feedback to percolate back in. Now, note, sometimes there may be a case where these A's and B's are existing in different systems. And if the business is telling me A always needs to be in sync with B, that might mean that I have to do distributed transactions between two systems. All right? So when talking about services, we'll talk a lot more about this going forwards. The demands of business consistency are really very important. Now you might be thinking, oh, okay, if I can't do pub/sub, I'll just go back to doing request response. Be aware, most of the time, if we're doing request response, we're still not doing transactions across these boundaries, right? If I'm doing a REST call to get the data, I'm not locking anything. But if the business is telling me, no, A and B always need to be in sync with each other, that's not just an indication you can't do pub/sub. It's an indication you can't do remote request response either. Not at least without putting some transaction around them. So that's usually an indication. If the business says you can't do pub/sub, then you can't do request response. And that means that ultimately these two things need to be together some way, and then you need to find some other way to pull them apart. Most of the time, the boundaries that you'll find that fit all of the business requirements end up looking very different than the boundaries that you thought would make sense when you did the original design. But tomorrow, when we get into service-oriented architecture, you'll see a lot more of that. Just giving you a hint of things to come. PubSub is not the kind of thing that you can just sprinkle everywhere. Say, oh, okay, you know, PubSub is going to make things scale, and it's going to remove my temporal coupling, and everything will be peachy. It's hard work to find the boundaries where PubSub makes sense. So obviously there's certain elements of doing remote communications that we want to abstract away where we're talking to, etc. There's a pattern, it's called the service agent pattern for ultimately abstracting away on the client side of the invocation. You can read some more about that. I don't want to spend too much time on that. Most of the stuff you can find via slides or Googling. It's not really that significant. The important thing, the important message of any type of spatial coupling is what we were saying before. Routing is first a logical concern and only after that a physical concern. We talked about that over here. Am I doing a report action or am I doing a fraud action? That's a logical concern. Am I sending a report message or a fraud message? That's a logical concern. Already at that level, that influences the first level of routing that is going to be happening. Behind that level, then we get into load balancers or competing consumers, which is the physical part of the routing. Okay? So when we're talking about spatial coupling, it's important to recognize first there's the logical element of it, and only afterwards there's the physical element. So report versus fraud, and then the load balancing. Why is this important? There are certain types of domains, and don't worry too much about the slides. I'm going to have to clean these up one of these days. Is that when you have, and I'm using the term message type a little bit loosely because we haven't gotten into messaging patterns just yet, that we want there to be a very strong affinity between the thing that I'm saying, add customer or order canceled, and a given logical domain. So for there to be a clear logical owner for each one of the types of messages that we're talking about. So think about it in the sense of strong typing reflecting a business decomposition. Now, for those of you who've been using in Service Bus for some time, you're like, I don't get it. This is what we always do. To contrast that, I want to talk about a different type of pattern that I haven't put up in the slides for the longest time because it's the don't do this. And my concern is that once I put something up that says don't do this, somebody's going to look at it and say, you know, maybe that'll work for us over here. All right? So the contrast to this is what's known as document-centric messaging. So when talking about document-centric messaging, think of the awful government forms that we sometimes have to fill out, where they're really, really long. And there's all sorts of sections that are like, this is for government use only. Or if you tick this box in section 2A, then you don't need to fill in section 3B, skip directly to section 4D. Have you ever experienced one of those awful forms? Okay. That's where we're coming from. Now, a lot of times when people go to automate those types of systems, they create those document-centric messages and workflows around it. In other words, they say, well, this is what the forms look like in the real world. We'll create software constructs that look the same way. Why is this something that you should be avoiding? Because it means that in order to know where to route this thing, I need to look at the innards of the message itself. Did they tick section 3B? Because if they did, I now need to route that to a certain location. That type of routing is known as content-based routing, and it creates a much higher degree of logical coupling between the pieces of code that are talking to each other. A better approach, like we described before, instead of having a monolithic construct, is to decompose this into multiple, smaller, more specific types of messages. where, all right, grab these three and pull those over there. And because this sometimes appears over here with those two, then we'll put that together with that over there, and we'll create a specific message type, all right? So try to avoid document-centric messaging, content-based routing, not because of spatial coupling, but because once you have that, it takes the spatial coupling and makes it a core part of your business logic. And that is not something that you want. You want to have stronger separation of concerns where possible. Yeah. Isn't that where SOAP brought things in? No. So SOAP is an enveloping schema. So in essence, it doesn't deal with the business contents of the message. It's all dealing with the headers on top of it. Now, one of the things that has been introduced by various queuing systems is header-based routing. And people sometimes, anybody using RabbitMQ here? Yeah, some RabbitMQ, one RabbitMQ. So RabbitMQ has header-based routing functionality. And sometimes people elevate certain fields from the message itself into headers for the purposes of driving routing. But it's not content-based routing. That's definitely not where SOAP came from. People were doing content-based routing even before SOAP was created. All right, this idea of document-centric messaging is not a new one. It's unfortunately one of those old patterns that just refuses to die. And it's usually sort of a V1 implementation of some kind of document-centric workflow. And sooner or later, people recognize the amount of complexity that it, because it ties in the physical routing of things with the logical responsibilities of them, but it didn't come from SOAP. It didn't originate there at all. All right? So avoid that. Instead, prefer these types of having more smaller, more specific message types that clearly articulate everything that needs to be done in there.